Hey everybody, what's going on? Hellmite here, bringing another video from Grab the Lantern today. Today I wanted to talk more on the Mythic item system, which is going to be removed in the new preseason. We already know about this and have known about it for quite some time, but today I wanted to talk about the items that I think are likely to be removed and which items are likely to stay. Riot have already said that there are some Mythic items that we know are going to be getting removed. They specifically called out Galeforce as one of the items that we already know is getting taken out of the game, but I thought it would be a good idea to look through all of the other Mythic items and talk about whether or not they're likely to stick around, or whether or not that they are going to get the axe. Now, most of these Mythic items are going to get a power down in some form as they make the transition from being a Mythic item to being a Legendary item. Riot have already said that this is a thing because they're going to be less impactful on their own, but that means in general then that they will likely cost less and that they'll be less build determinative, right? Saying I have to build this one specific item in every game and then I have options from there instead of being able to flex your build around more often. Without further ado, let's jump into things, starting in the top side of the map with the top lane tank items. These are, of course, Radiant Virtue, Jak'Sho the Protean, Heartsteel, and Iceborne Gauntlet. Of these, I think Jak'Sho the Protean is the most likely to just be removed from the game. I really feel like Jak'Sho does too much to address a tank's wants. It just sort of makes tanks generically more tanky without really introducing that much gameplay. It does kind of say, yeah, there's a wind-up time to it, so once the tank gets the Jak'Sho to proc, they're a lot more scary in the team fight from that point on, but it has to have that sort of wind-up period. But in general, I think it's too good. I think it crowds out most other tank item options, and in general, as a result of this, I think it's just not the kind of item that I would like to stick around. I think that even if Riot nerfed it, because it does everything for a tank, if they nerfed it, it just does everything but less, and then it sort of enters one of those places where it's either the best item that you can be building, or it's literally not statistically good enough to bother building at all, and as a result, I think it's likely to get the axe. Heartsteel is another one that I'm not entirely sure if it will stick around or not. I think Heartsteel is a very fun item and a very popular item because it lets any champion go infinite, but to me it's another one of those generic items. It sort of just gives health with some degree of damage output, which is kind of nice, but maybe not a advantage that tanks specifically should enjoy. It's also, I think, a noob trap a lot of the time. People will be building a Heartsteel when they're going 0-2 in lane, and it's like, you can't build that item now because you're already losing. You don't have the option of then trading with your opponent to get stacks because they will beat you in a fight, and you're going to get it so late that you can't be stacking on it early enough for it to matter, if that makes sense. But I think it's very popular, and as a result, I think that there's a chance it sticks around. My personal gut feeling is that with other tank items sort of coming more to the forefront again once Mythic items go away, that there's no need for a Heartsteel anymore, but there is potentially a chance that it remains. Radiant Virtue is another generically tanky item that I think also may get removed. It has a very powerful active that I think is also just unnoticed by a lot of players. It's obviously very strong in professional play where champions know what they're doing and when they're going in to proc it, but otherwise I feel like in casual play it just doesn't have a lot of value. There aren't a lot of tank players that really want to buy it, and I think that in general it basically says you are generically tanky, you're providing generic value to your team that basically your team isn't noticing. I think it's a safe cut, but I also could see it remain as sort of a useful, I don't have a champion fantasy of my own, but I want to be able to contribute to the team sort of tank item. And as a result, I think that there is a chance that this remains. I think it's more likely than Heartsteel as an example, and way more likely than Jak'Sho, but time will only tell if this item will remain. Iceborne Gauntlet, I think, is absolutely going to stay. I think its removal was one of the biggest issues I had with the Mythic item system when it first came out. I think its reintroduction was very good, and I think that it is the most likely to stay, therefore, when the Mythic item system goes away. I think it's a very powerful item for specific tanks. I don't think it's so windmill slammable that every tank will buy it regardless if it's the only Mythic item, or quote-unquote Mythic item remaining after the cuts. In general, I just really like what Iceborne Gauntlet does. I think it has a good niche. I don't think it's so good that every tank is going to want it. In general, I think it's a very good option overall. Next up, let's talk about the fighter items. These are Gore Drinker, Stride Breaker, Trinity Force, and Divine Sunderer. Generally, I think that these items are sort of 50-50 for me. Stride Breaker is the number one that I think is just going to get removed. Riot have already talked about how they don't want items to give champions like big gameplay warping actives, and Stride Breaker has that. It's one of the best items in the business at preventing champions like Garen and Darius from being kited, therefore shortcutting one of their intended weaknesses. Garen and Darius have certain traits and advantages specifically because they're kiteable, and the second you say they're no longer kiteable, you run into lots of issues. And as a result, I think Stridebreaker is a very easy candidate for removal, especially when you also consider it was being splashed on a lot of assassins and other lighter fighters that shouldn't find it useful, but that did anyways because it was just that strong. I think it's a very easy candidate to just be removed. Goredrinker is in a similar boat, but I'm less inclined to say it should be removed because there are a lot of sustain-heavy fighters, right? Champions like Aatrox, for example, that really, really like Goredrinker and want it to stick around in the game. But in general, I think that it occupies too much of a power budget in these champions' kits. I think that Goredrinker in some form should remain as a general Omnivamp lifesteal type item. Maybe Riot are saying Ravenous Hydra is that item for these types of champions, but I like the idea of something that's less snowball-y and more generally good for these kinds of champions. I think it's likely to stay in some form, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was removed altogether. Divine Sunder is an item that I think should be removed. I don't know if Riot agree with me on this. Sunder, I think, crowds out other Sheen item choices. It feels like it was just generally the best thing you could be doing on the vast majority of fighters, and I think that if Stridebreaker goes away, it will continue to be the best thing that you could be doing on the vast majority of fighters. Garen and Darius, as examples, will just go Divine Sunder. They will just buy that item. They won't even look at Trinity Force. They will say, nah, Divine Sunder does everything I want and more. I think as a result of this, it's too good at what it does, and I think it should be removed because there are a lot of other Sheen options that it just kind of crowds out, and I think it's too good at its intended role of tank busting. I think that fighters have lots of options to tank bust. They don't need a Divine Sunder on top of this, but Riot have kept it in the game for quite some time. It survived a couple of iterations of the Mythic item system, so I'm not confident in this prediction, but I think at the very least it should be removed. Trinity Force, meanwhile, I think is in a great spot as a remaining fighter item. There were a ton of fighters that were building it pre-Mythic item system, Garen and Darius foremost among them, that just didn't build it afterwards because they only got one Mythic and they sort of needed other items. I think once you say the Mythic item system no longer exists and you can build Trinity Force alongside other options, lots more champions will be picking up Trinity Force. I think it's a very good item. I think a lot of players have sort of discovered that it is quite powerful, but I also think it's being crowded out currently because of Divine Sunder. If Divine Sunder is also removed, I think Trinity Force becomes a very enticing fighter pick, and as a result, I think it has a very good chance at remaining basically in the same form that it is right now, though of course a little bit weaker because of it being a Mythic item. Moving on to talk about AD Assassins, which have three options, these being Youmuu's Ghostblade, Duskblade of Drakthar, and Eclipse. Duskblade is going to get removed. I don't think there's a way around it, you guys. I think it's been like the de facto best assassin item in the game since it came out. It was obviously very frustrating when it was making the champion invisible as well as untargetable. I think it's still frustrating even though it only makes them untargetable. I think that it just crowds out all of the other assassin options, and even with the removal of Mythic items and you being allowed to build anything you want, most assassins I think will just be grabbing this item because it's good. As a result, I think it's too good, and I think it probably should be removed as a result. Eclipse, I'm of two minds about. On one hand, I really think assassins need an anti-tank, anti-fighter item. A lot of times, assassins can find victories in games by saying, I 1v1 anybody on your team, so I'm just going to go into side lane and split push, and you can't send anybody that stops me. And tanks are too good at stonewalling that, right? I'm Malphite, I'm big and stupid, and I've built a bunch of armor, and I just can't be killed by your pitiful assassin, right? Eclipse is a very good balancing lever in this particular matchup. I think it does a very good job of saying, actually, you can be killed because I have an Eclipse, or I can win in time by trading with you whenever my Eclipse is up. But I think it's a little too on the powerful side. It's very easy to proc, it provides extra damage, it provides extra durability, it has Omnivamp attached to it, which is very powerful. It's too strong, and I think that nerfing it would potentially make it too weak in a similar fashion to how we were talking about the Jack Show previously. But I like the niche it has, and I feel like Riot could find a way to rework it so that it could stay, but also not be overwhelmingly strong. Finally, Youmuu's Ghostblade was brought up specifically because Prowler's Claw was reworked to be no longer a Mythic item. Youmuu's is great. It'll lose some of the things that it gained by becoming a Mythic, but in general, it'll still be a very powerful item, and I think will be more powerful and more buildable in a world where Duskblade of Drakthar doesn't exist. So I'm very excited for that, but it will certainly stick around, no problems. Next up, let's talk about Mage itemization. This involves Crown of the Shattered Queen, Everfrost, Liandry's Anguish, and Luden's Tempest. Liandry's Anguish has been a personal pet peeve of mine for quite some time. I think it's too good as a one-stop shop for too many champions, as saying you get a very good passive and a very good stat block on top of it being your mana item. I think that for champions like Malzahar, for example, they just don't interact with the item system because they say, yes please to Liandry's Anguish and literally don't think about their purchases at all. And in general, I don't like the gameplay it provides. I think that it says you just do generically more damage by damaging enemy champions. That's not particularly interesting or exciting in my book. I think it would be much more interesting as an item that, I think it needs to stick around because it's very good at busting tanks, which mages do need help with dealing with, but I think it's generally too good as a one-stop shop buy like this. I would love to see it stay in the game, but I would love to see it removed from the sort of lost chapter item pool and for mages to make other choices. So in general, I think it's okay to stick around, but it shouldn't be a lost chapter item anymore. Luden's Tempest is fine. I think it can totally stay. There's no issues with it. It was previously a mana item before. It's a mana item now. It has okay gameplay. It isn't generically more damage because even though you can get the burst of damage after stacking up enough charges, you have to stack those charges, meaning that's better for champions that want to be playing more hit-and-run type playstyles or that have high mobility. In general, I really like what the item does, and it can absolutely stay. Everfrost is likely to be removed. It has one of those big game warping actives with the CC. This means that if you're a champion with crowd control like Lysandra, you have even more crowd control. If you're a champion with very micro crowd control like Silas, for example, roping in with Abduct, he then can CC you even further with Everfrost to get off another rotation. It's very powerful. I think that people have learned how to use it very effectively, but I think because of that, it shouldn't exist because it does sort of feel like you're playing the item more so than the champion, and as a result, I think that that's a pretty easy candidate for removal. Crown of the Shattered Queen is a very strong item, but I don't necessarily think it should be removed. I think it's a very useful option for mages that don't want to die to burst champions, and I think that it does work very well for some of the mage champions that don't have a particularly good item. Xerath, for example, doesn't really care about any of the other three options, but really likes Crown of the Shattered Queen. That said, in the previous item system, we had lots of items that you could build early on as a mage to not die to your opponent. Variant Barrier against AP and Seeker's Arm Guard against AD. As a result, I think those are the options you can go for in the new system, rushing into a Banshee's Veil or Zhonya's Hourglass respectively, as opposed to buying a generic catch-all anti-burst item that also gives you your mana. But I think it's generally been less of a problem than some of the other AP items or some of the other items that we've talked about in general, and as a result, I think it's more likely to stick around than the others, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was removed in its entirety. Next up, let's talk about the AP Bruiser and Assassin items. It's sort of a weird catch-all category because lots of mages build these, lots of Bruisers build other items, right? But in general, let's talk about these. These are, of course, Rod of Ages, Night Harvester, Hextech Rocket Belt, and Rift Maker. First up, Rod of Ages will absolutely stay. It was obviously a very big candidate when it was removed from the game the first time. People were very upset about it. When it came back, people were very excited. I think you're going to remove a lot of the satisfaction buffs that Riot gave it, including the bonus level when it's fully stacked and the bonus movement speed. I don't think you need those because people were already opting into Rod of Ages back in the day because it just gave them generically lots of stats, and that's what they cared about, and it wasn't like the only item that they were building. And items in general had lower of a bar as to being satisfying. They could just be stat 6 like Rabadon's Death Cap, and you didn't kind of care. So I think that in general, Rod of Ages will stick around in mostly the same form that it is currently. Night Harvester is the kind of item that I think could also stay. It's a very powerful item for AP assassins that sort of don't have itemization options of their own, right? Like, until the Mythic item system, they just sort of poached other items from, other classes and said, yes, I build this item. And I think Night Harvester is, one of the only items that AP assassins can really say is their own. And as a result, I think it should stay. I do think it needs a pretty hefty nerf as far as the bonus damage goes when you enter combat, but I do like the item in general as it helps AP assassins say, yes, this is something that I can use. Riftmaker is in a similar boat. I think it's a very stat-sticky item, but it's also one of the only items that AP Bruisers have access to that's sort of theirs and theirs alone. There aren't a lot of AP Bruisers in the game. I can name maybe 3 or 4 off the top of my head, and some of them even have different build paths that they can do anyways. And as a result, I really feel like the champions that need it, they really, really need this item. I think it absolutely needs to stick around in some form or another. Obviously, it could be nerfed, but I think that this sort of item that says you can thrive in a fight and have some degree of Omnivamp and have some degree of damage and durability, I think it makes a lot of sense in an item for AP Bruisers specifically to take advantage of, so I think it needs to stick around in the game. Finally, Rocket Belt, I think, will take on a new life in a post-Mythic item system. I think it's a very powerful item that most champions weren't building because they couldn't, because Mythic item exclusivity. I think that now that that's going away, there are going to be a lot more champions like Brand and Annie who can theoretically go Rocket Belt and feel okay about the item, using it to get themselves in a range. But in general, I don't feel like it will have much of an audience past its core users anyways, things like Fiddlesticks or Kennen. Generally, they were already happy with the item beforehand, building it exclusively from everything else, and in general, I feel like that's not a bad thing for them to have as a result. Next up, let's talk about the marksman items, and this is going to be a very fast category. They're all staying, except for Galeforce. I think Infinity Edge, Navori Quickblades, and Ginzu's Rageblade are obviously historical items that have been balanced for marksmen for years now, and they were only made Mythic items because marksmen really wanted those items, and those were the items that they were sort of basing their build paths around in general, and as a result, I feel like nothing is going to change except the items will stop being Mythic and just go back to being legendary like they were before. Obviously, Infinity Edge and Navori Quickblades will still stay separated from each other. I think that Ginzu's Rageblade sort of already says don't build me with the other two because you can't crit, and those items are specifically crit amp items. So in general, that kind of helps out there. But all of these can stay. I think they all have very useful options and things that they do for the champions that build them. Galeforce, we already know, is getting removed. It's too hard for Riot to balance AD carries around having a dash. Any future designs you make for AD carries have to account for the fact that they could have a dash through systemic options like Galeforce, and as a result, it's a very easy cut for Riot. We know this one's removing, guys, so it doesn't matter what you think about it, it's gone. Finally, let's talk about the support items in the game. These are Shrelia's Battle Song, Everfrost, Locket of the Iron Solari, Moonstone Renewer, and Echoes of Helia. I think most of these are going to stay. I actually really like the designs of the majority of these support items and that they're very useful for the kinds of champions that are building them. Locket of the Iron Solari is a historical item that is very powerful on the more supportive tank supports that just want to be peeling for their AD carry and protecting their team with a well-timed big shield, as well as providing aura value. I think Everfrost is a good item for the more aggressive tank supports. It just says, hey, whatever you're already doing, I make it slightly better, and as a result, you're playing the champion still, not the item. I think that makes it very well positioned in a post-Mythic item world. Shrelia's, I think, is going to take nerfs in some form or another, but I think it's a very powerful item. A lot of people really like the item. It will likely lose the movement speed on shield. I think that that was sort of the part of the item that was very powerful, but I think that absolutely the active will remain, and the item in general will stay mostly in the same state that it is right now. Echoes of Helia, I'm not entirely sure about. I think that it's a useful item for more aggressive enchanter supports that want to be getting up in people's grills and doing lots of damage. Karma support, for example, I think synergizes very well with this item. But I also think it's very powerful, almost too powerful. There's a reason Athene's Unholy Grail was removed from the game, and as a result, I could see Echoes of Helia being removed and aggressive enchanter supports just being told, hey, build AP, right? You don't have to worry about this item, just build AP. I can totally see a world in which that happens. Finally, Moonstone Renewer, I think, will take a nerf in some regards, similar to Echoes of Helia. It may also be removed, as it is a very powerful item for more supportive enchanter supports. But in general, it, again, is one of those items that just says, whatever you're already doing, I make it better, and as a result, I could see it sticking around in some form or another. But you guys left in what you think down in the comment section below about the general items that exist in the game, which mythics you think are likely to stay and which mythics you think are likely to leave. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed the video today, go ahead and leave it a like, and if you really enjoyed the video, consider subscribing. I upload a video every Monday, Friday, and on patch days as well. Once again, thank you guys so very much for watching. I do appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.